Good evening, everybody. My name's Omane Abu, and I work for the City of Glendale Water Services Department. You've already seen her in the chat, but Joanne Toms is also joining me, and she also works for the Water Services Department. And we have Jonathan Manning, our guest presenter. And the topic for tonight is creating drought resilient landscapes. But before diving in, we got to go over our webinar logistics. So attendees are muted and the class will be recorded. The recording will be available on the city's water conservation website and YouTube channel in about a week. Those links to those sites are included in the class reminder email, and they will be in the follow-up email as well. You can type your questions and comments in the Q&A box or use the chat functions, and Joanne and I will read and respond to as many as we can throughout the webinar. The class is scheduled to be 1.5 hours long. We have 1 hour allotted for the presentation, and we'll try to leave about 30 minutes for questions. We do want to try to stay on track, and we want to be respectful of your time. If you experience any significant technical difficulties, you can contact Joanne Toms via email or phone. Her email is jtoms@glendaleaz.com, or you can call her at 623-930-3596. After this presentation, we'll follow up with an email that includes a copy of the PowerPoint, the resources, recording, and a link to the survey. And if you complete the survey, you'll be entered in for a chance to win a gift card to a local nursery to buy up some water-wise plants. So please fill that out. We really value your feedback. And just to go over some Zoom attendee features, this is what your current view might resemble. You can play around with the features so you're comfortable. You can click and drag the vertical bar located in between the presenter and the presentation to enlarge or shrink the presentation view. You can also adjust the audio settings in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. And again, we've already kind of played with the chat a little bit, but feel free to send comments using the chat, or you can share your questions using that Q&A button. Again, Joanne and I will do our best to answer questions during the presentation, and then we'll also save some question time at the end of this presentation as well. But really quickly, I wanted to go over some publications that are available, and those links were included in the class reminder email. And again, I'll include that in the follow-up email as well. So the first publication is Landscape Plants for the Arizona Desert. And this is a publication that has more than 200 low maintenance, water thrifty, and beautiful plants that thrive in Arizona. Next, we have Landscaping with Style in the Arizona Desert, and this is a step-by-step guide about design, installation, and care of your new low-maintenance landscape. And lastly, we have Landscape Watering by the Numbers, and this is a tool to determine how much water your plants need to ensure they're healthy and then that they're beautiful. And so you can access these guides and other publications online using the links. And Glendale residents can request to have a hard copy mailed by filling out the request form. The link's on the slide. And if you're living in a different city, you can check with your water provider to see if they're going to be able to mail you a hard copy. But if not, there's those virtual links that are available to access the information. But enough of me talking. I'm very excited to introduce you to our presenter tonight. So Jonathan Manning has been an ISA certified arborist since 2008. He's manager of Elgin Nursery and Tree Farm and owner of Holiday Farms LLC. Everybody give a virtual round of applause to help me welcome Jonathan Manning. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for teaching this presentation. We're looking forward to it.
Yeah, thank you all for showing up. And hopefully we can figure out how to save some water and still have beautiful landscapes right here in the Southwest Desert. So my name is Jonathan Manning. My experience comes from just a lifetime of loving plants and living in the Southwest Desert. I've been a grower for a nursery in town for 27 years, and I've tried so many things, everything that I thought would be possibly a good plant to grow in this area. Not all of them were, that I've seen plants go through the worst of summer, the hottest of summers, the coldest of winters, ones that can handle our weather, but in shade, ones that can handle full sun. And so the plant selection and how to maintain plants to deal with our environment and how to irrigate them to make the whole landscape resilient is what we'll talk about in this class. And it is kind of 3 parts like that. We'll go over picking the right plants because there is some winners out there, lots of them really. I'll talk just about resources where you can find lists of all those. and the difference between picking plants that aren't really adapted to our climate and ones that are, and then how you maintain those plants, you know, from trimming to staking to everything you could do to that plant maintenance wise to make it hardier to our extreme environment. And then lastly, how to irrigate those plants so they can grow deep roots in the ground. Mainly that's about plants, they store water in their roots, leafy trees and shrubs, you know, and so you want the root system to be very big and very deep underground so they can hold a lot of water for a long time and not have to be irrigated so often. So we'll talk about all three of those things and how to make a landscape that's resistant to drought, heat, and everything else that our environment could throw at it. And I'm just going to switch to my PowerPoint here. We'll get going that way. Yes. Except for on the wrong slide. And it's not letting me. Okay, sorry about that. Little technical difficulties, but there's the opening slide where it has my email if you'd like to write that down. Or just, you know, like she said, it's recorded, so you can go back to it. But never be afraid to use my email to send me pictures, questions. You know, it's a wonderful way for me to be able to help people these days without having to drive all the way to their house and, you know, do it the old-fashioned hard way. So you can send me pictures and questions of problems you're having, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can as far as email. So.
And then Jonathan, I'm
yeah.
not sure if it's still lagging, but I still see like the like before you're doing the slideshow, like I can see like the different slides on like the sidebar.
Oh, okay. I'm going to stop sharing and try it again.
Okay.
And then see if. Is it now? Is it
Perfect. Yes.
Okay, full screen first slide. All right, now we can get started. So so there's my email if you didn't see it the first time. And you can go back to it. So the next yeah, now it's now it's not letting me switch slides. Okay.
Oops, I was talking and I didn't unmute myself. Even when you press like the arrow keys, it doesn't let you.
That's what I was trying to use, yeah.
So I see the first thing first, plant selection and placement.
Yeah, it pulls it. Oh, here we go. Okay, now we're good. And that's the next slide. So first things first is, I think we're good. I'm able to switch slides now. And so the first thing is the plants that you select. As I said, plants that just are not, no matter what I've done over the years, they just aren't quite hardy in our climate. You know, a lot of them do great in Southern California. A lot of them will do great at higher elevation. A lot of them will do great in places with more humidity, like Florida. But they just don't really ever become hardy here. So those kind of plants you want to avoid, because no matter what you do, they're never going to be resistant, and they're always going to need extra water and extra care. And even then you still get a plant that's not very pretty. It's just barely hanging on, if that. So the differences are obvious in some palms, like some plants. This is a good example that I like to use because the queen palms are a very good seller at the nursery. Lots of people, they walk in, love the way that they look. That's the one on the left, you know, long feathery fronds, very, very tropical. That is the case. They're very tropical, and we're not tropical here. So they tend to have those burnt leaves like this one has a lot, yellow leaves, burnt leaves. They don't like the heat that we get. They don't like the dry air that we get. They don't like the salty soil that they grow in here. So So for almost the same look, if you could kind of wrap your mind around, like the one on the right is a Canary Island date palm. They're from a climate similar to ours. They love it here, love the dry air. They grow fast. They're dark green always, And so you just a little bit of tweak in what you think might be beautiful out there, and you'll have much better luck and much better success. And I think in the end, not only are you saving water, because they're much more drought tolerant, but you end up with a prettier plant and a more beautiful plant because of it. So it's all about selecting plants that are adapted to other climates like ours. So a lot of times when I grow a new plant, the first thing I do is look up where they're from in the world, because there's a lot of places have climates like ours. A lot of South America, Africa, South Africa, um, Australia, a lot of plants we use are from other continents even, but they work here because they're from a similar climate in those other places. So try to pick plants that are desert adapted, and you'll have much better success. So it's not just about picking the species, the kind of plant that are well adapted to our climate, but it's also about where you put that plant. So there's something to be said for knowing how big the plant or tree is going to get, and you pick a spot where it's able to get to its full size. Because if you don't allow it to grow to its full size, people think, well, I'll just trim it and make it the size I want. But it becomes a battle that most people in the end don't want to continue fighting when you try to keep something much smaller than it's meant to be. And also, again, this is about saving water and being resilient to drought. When you trim on a tree over and over and over again, they use a lot more water. So this is a good example. This photo here is a Dalbergia sisu tree on the right that's probably got 10 years on the little tiny southern live oak on the left that was just planted. Well, that oak has no chance of ever becoming a beautiful big oak tree because it's underneath that sisu tree. And this is the problem of they're two different yards. So it's like the communication between the two, I'm sure, is not there. But in the end, these two trees are going to struggle with each other forever, because the sisu is much more vigorous, much stronger, much older, and it's always going to shade out and grow over that oak tree and never give it a chance. So just make sure that you know how big that your plants that you buy are going to get, not how big they are now, but how big they eventually are going to get, and try to pick a spot in your yard where they are in the right, that they can grow into that space and get to their full height without continuously trimming on them all the time. Another thing is about exposure. So you want to make sure that if you are going to put a plant in the full sun, make sure it's a plant that'll handle full sun. And some plants need shade. Make sure you put those in some shade. And so exposure is important too. You get the plants that are suited to our climate. You get the plants that are suited to the place in your yard that you're going to put them, size wise and sun exposure wise. And then you'll have that success that we're talking about. Let's see. So resources locally, and that's important because there's all kinds of information on the internet, not all kinds of information about our particular climate. So many things are different here. Even if you're a vegetable gardener, you'll notice that all the vegetables that people grow in the summer in most of the country, we grow in the winter here. It's the exact opposite in a lot of cases. So the best time to plant trees and shrubs here is really the fall, not the spring. So it's a lot of things are different about our climate. It's rare in the United States, this Southwest desert and the way we do things here. So get local information. And AMWA is Arizona Municipal Water Users Association, and they have a wonderful website with, you can also find plants that are desert adapted on their website, and a whole lot of information about how to and what plants grow well here. There's also a list of courses all over town, like the one you're in now, that you can get all kinds of local information at also. And the Desert Botanical Gardens is amazing if you've never been there. It's world famous for being a wonderful collection of desert adapted plants. And it's also just a beautiful place to visit. So make sure you go there if you haven't been there yet. So that's a little picture, just a wildflower garden at the Desert Botanical Gardens, but there's all kinds of different parts of it to walk through, and a lot of information that you can get from them too on their website. Another picture of a night. You can go there, they're open at night, certain parts of the year where you can see everything lit up like that in the picture. So now you know what types of plants, you've done your research, you know, you've got local information about what plants grow here, and you've kind of checked in your yard what, you know how big those plants get. Usually when you're looking through lists of plants, they'll have the mature size and if they need full sun or shade. So you've noticed all those things about the plants, pick the plants out, put them in the right parts of your yard where they're going to fit and where they get the right sun exposure. And now let's go find some, right? So you go to the nursery looking for these plants that you've picked out. Because I've been in the nursery growing plants for so long, I'll just give you a few things that I've noticed aren't so obvious to a lot of people when they go to buy plants. One is, if they're rooted, the left-hand picture is if they're rooted into the ground, they're going to be the most beautiful plant in the block. So you go to the nursery and all these plants are about waist high, 1 feet tall. It's because it's rooted in the ground. And that's not a good thing, because the only way I've ever been able to compensate for uprooting a plant like that and make it live through the process, when you chop all those roots off, they're out the bottom of the pot and into the ground, you have to lose leaf on top to compensate, or else the plant's going to die. It'll wilt, it'll drop leaves within days, and it'll eventually spiral to death as it drops leaves, sunburns, all that. It's a bad situation. It's better to pick the best one of those plants that's not rooted in the ground. So make sure, wiggle it a little bit, move it, rock it side to side, make sure it's not rooted in the ground. Especially if you're tagging tree. I've seen so many people tag trees in nursery. You know, they give you a little piece of tape to tag it with, and you wrap it around the tree you want, and then you set up a delivery, right? They go out there after you're gone, chop that thing up, ship it to you, put it in the ground, and see you later. And if the thing dies, maybe there's no warranty and you're out, and all because you weren't aware that it was rooted into the ground. So make sure it's something you check. If the plant, tree especially, that you're buying is rooted into the ground, I would not buy it. The next thing is just make sure that it's pretty green. I mean, this one's more obvious. The picture on the right there has an elm tree that's suffering from probably a little bit of root disease, and it makes it where it can't absorb the right nutrients, turns yellow, whatever. So yellow's never good. You know, to pick a dark green leaf, healthy growing, active growth tips. And if you plant that tree in the ground without damaging any roots, it's going to continue being beautiful and growing well after you put it in the ground. So that's another thing to look for, is just health, general health, color, and vigor. So the one on the left is something a lot of people don't pay attention to. These two slides I like to point out because as an arborist, there's a lot of opinions out there about whether you should trim roots on a tree or shrub before you put it in the ground. Some people say every time trim roots, score the sides to avoid wrapped roots. There's a truth to that, but I also have seen every tree that I've done it to suffer for either a long time before it finally recovers or die in the process. What's not usually mentioned is that you can only do this during certain times of the year. As far as trimming roots, it has to be nice weather, spring or fall. Can't do it in the middle of summer. Sometimes you can do it if a tree goes dormant in the winter without a problem, but that part's rarely mentioned, that there's a certain time of year that only when you can do it safely without killing the tree. And I don't think it's always necessary. In my opinion, it's much better to know how to pick a tree or a shrub for that matter, that won't need to have its roots pruned. So we're going to learn how to pick a tree with a healthy root system, and then you're not going to cut those roots or damage them whatsoever as you put it in the ground. And there'll be no transient shock, no wilt, no suffering afterward. So the left-hand picture is to show you that you're looking for a high level of mulch, of soil in the pot. So the one on the left, there's the picture on the left has two pots. The pot on the left, you can see how deep the soil level is. That's been in that pot for at least a year. So no nursery plants that low. We always start like the one on the right, high soil level. You got to leave a little tiny space for water, but it's an inch or so. Any nursery is going to plant the newly planted tree into the next size pot with that high of a soil level. Well, what happens is usually 60 to 80% of that mix is organic matter, which means it decomposes over time. So it breaks down, compost, if you want to say that, and washes out the bottom of the pot. So year after year, the level of the soil goes down. I've seen plants that are growing in nothing but just 3 inches of root in the bottom of the pot, and the only reason they're alive is because they get watered 3 times a day to keep them that way. So you want to avoid a very low level of soil, because it means it's been in that pot getting root bound longer and longer and longer. So nice high soil level. I mean, you don't want it to be planted yesterday, but if it was planted 2-3 months ago, perfect, and you can tell that by the soil level it should be up high. It should, you can tell if it's planted yesterday because the soil on top, like raw mulch, it's like as time goes on, the mulch fades to white. It starts looking like bark chips, and then it fades its way with just a little bit of sun, a couple months of sun, it fades to like white on top. You'll know it's well rooted, not rooted in the ground, and not really low soil level. That's that part. The other part, the picture on the right, is about the worst thing that could happen to a tree. And this is what people are saying when they say you got to look for circling roots, girdling roots, and you have to trim those before you plant it. You can find the girdling roots that matter are all the way on the surface of the ground. If the circling root, that wrap, you see how the root is a complete circle around the trunk. What happens is, as that trunk gets fatter and fatter and fatter, the root chokes it. It's a tourniquet, like a noose or whatever. So the root doesn't get bigger around, the trunk does, and it ends up, I've seen many a tree fall over after 10 years, and the trunk is fat above ground, and right underground where that circling root is, the trunk goes down to about a 3 or 4 inch diameter, and that's where it snaps off in the wind someday. So it's a very bad situation for any tree, but it's very easy to find in a nursery pot. You're walking through all the trees in the nursery, take your finger and move the soil around where the trunk goes into the ground, goes into the soil. And if you can usually dig even with your finger 2 inches deep, say, and if it looks like those roots go nice and straight down into the soil and don't circle around, then you're good, and you don't have to trim any roots when you plant it. So the roots that might circle at the bottom of the pot don't matter, because the tree can grow new roots above that point in the foot or so of soil that there is between the surface and the bottom. So it's easy to find. If you follow these rules looking for a tree, then you shouldn't have to trim those roots as you put it in the ground. And then you won't have to worry about what time of year to do it, and if you're going to kill the tree or not, or how much transplant shock you're going to go through after you trim the roots. So just pick a good tree, a healthy tree, now that you know how, and avoid all that. So planting instructions, there's tons of videos out there. I just happen to know this one because we made it. But elginnursery.com has a how-to videos about how to plant a 15-gallon tree and how to plant a box-sized tree. They might be helpful in how to plant those trees without breaking that root up and causing transplant shock. So that's enough of that. Remember just not to try to break any roots, and it's difficult, especially there's plants like bougainvillea and citrus that no matter how hard you try, carefully slide them out of the pot, the whole thing falls apart every time, because they just don't make a lot of root. Those kind of plants, they don't make enough root to like hold all that heavy wet soil together. So you're going to break the roots off every time trying to slide them out of the pot. And so the key is to lay it next to the hole, cut the bottom off the plastic pot with a razor knife or pruners, put it down in the hole, and then finally cut the sides off the pot and pull it up out of the hole, so you carefully get it in there without breaking it all apart. It's key. I've seen it a million times in person, what happens to plants when the roots break off, and it's never pretty. So staking is another thing that people can do to harm a perfectly well adapted desert plant. And then there's things that you can do with staking that end up making it not a good plant after all. So we'll do this. So this is a beautiful multiple trunk mesquite tree, the way mesquite trees naturally grow. And this is usually because the plans called for every tree to have 2 lodge poles and a wire, which I get. If that would have been a single trunk tree, it would have needed that. But we probably sent a multiple trunk tree instead of a single trunk tree. I don't know. But either way, if it's a multiple trunk tree standing up on its own with no stake from the nursery, you'll never need to put a stake on it. Don't go back and stake a tree that doesn't come with a stake on it. The only time you need a stake is when the stake comes from the nursery with the stake on it, and when you take that stake off, it bends over. and it's almost always going to be single trunk trees. And I am not a fan of single trunk trees at all here in the desert. It's one of those things that if you go for a hike out in the desert, look around. There is not one single trunk tree in the whole desert. Every one of them is a multiple trunk tree, low and wide. And there's so many reasons why they grow like that, and why they've evolved to grow like that in the wild. It's the way they survive our climate. So let them do it. Let them do what they've developed over millions of years to do to survive our extreme intense sunlight and heat and drought and all that. So this is a good example of a multiple trunk Palo Verde tree. You can still get it up out of it's been trimmed up to where you can get under it now. You plant other things under it. You can walk around. It doesn't have to take up your whole yard a foot off the ground. So there is some trimming you can do, but just try to never make our desert trees into single trunk lollipop shaped trees like you would find people saying from other climates to do with the trees that grow in their climates. So it is different. This is about local information again. So citrus is another one that if you see citrus with the white trunk painted white, there is a function for that. It's because the skin of citrus is very, very sensitive to sunburn. So if you trim that up so you can walk under it or put a picnic table under it or whatever, it's going to burn. The trunk's going to burn because like the picture is the way citrus trees are meant to be. They shade their own trunk. They shade the ground under them. So this is the healthiest way for a citrus tree to be. If you don't have the space for them to be that way, then maybe buy a variety of citrus that's a smaller variety, like a tangerine or a Mexican lime, if you don't have the space for a giant lemon tree to be this way or something. Or you eventually let it get so big that the top can shade its trunk, and you can then finally trim up the bottom a little bit. But especially when they're younger, this is the way that a citrus tree has adapted to deal with our heat, is by having branches that grow really low and shade all the trunks and branches on the inside. It's very easy to kill a citrus tree by trimming in the summer because you remove that shade that they're counting on. If you let sunlight shine into the middle of that tree by trimming or up or down or whatever way you trim, it's going to harm the skin of the branches and trunks in a way that they don't come back from sometimes ever. So careful, just again, let the trees do what they're meant to do, and try to give them the space they need to be that way, because that's the way you make a resilient tree out of these trees that are perfectly able to handle our climate if you let them be the way they are naturally. So staking, this is back to staking. I see many, you don't know how bad I want to pull over and cut these off of people's trees when I see them. It's a death sentence for this tree. See how fat the tree is above. So what this is, if you don't see it, is a old lodgepole stake. It used to have two wires going in, and a really loose wire had the trunk in the middle of it, right? You're supposed to have the trunk on a single trunk tree. When you stake it, those wire kits are so that the trunk can wiggle inside of that wire ring, and that's supposed to get them fatter and fatter and be on their own, and then you can take this off. You can take this off in 6 months, maybe a year, not any longer, because what's happened here is the trunk has gotten so fat that it's grown around that wire, which now is impossible to get it out from inside the wood. You could cut it. It would be nice to cut it and pull out what you can, but you're going to have to leave some of it in there, which always leaves a weak spot on that tree, and which always makes a point where it could break. And it also, if you see how much fatter it is above the wire that's choking it than under the wire that's choking it, that's because the way trees work is the leaves on top make sugar. They send that sugar down to the roots for storage. And what's happening here is by choking it out, that sugar can't get to the roots anymore. So you have a very small, weak root system on a tree like this. You can't see that, but it's down there. And that makes a tree that wants to blow over later on too. Because of a root system that's being starved, because it can't get that sugar that's bubbling up and out above the wire. So all kinds of problems from this happening that are fatal. So get them stakes, if you have to use stakes, on a single trunk tree that came from the nursery with a stake. Leave them on there as temporary. My rule is if the trunk is bigger around than that lodgepole, it's time to get them off and cross your fingers, because you can trim the top of the tree a little bit if you think it's going to fall over or be too heavy on top. Take the weight off the top of the tree if that's what it takes, but get the stakes off, because if the trunk is as big around as that lodgepole, That means that when the wind comes, tries to blow it over, the lodgepole is weaker, being a dead piece of wood that's been in the ground for a year, than the live trunk that's rubbery and flexible. So if the trunk's as big around as the dead wood lodgepole, the lodgepole's not doing anything for it if a real big wind really comes up. So get those stakes off there, please. This is what happens. There's a wire about 2 feet off the ground that's so swallowed up you'll never see it again, but I know it's there because of what's happening to the tree. See the big fat bubble about halfway, about, it would be about waist high on that tree. All the growth that's happening underneath that that point is trying to recover. So let me regroup. That wire is buried in the trunk like the other one was. All that sugar from the top of the leaves is trying to get to the roots. It bubbles up and can't get down there. So what does the tree do? It's going to abandon the whole top of itself and regrow those suckers. That's why all the suckers keep coming out and coming out and coming out, because the tree, for as far as the tree's concerned, no big deal. It's just going to abandon the original tree that you're looking at and regrow a new tree from those suckers at the bottom, and then the problem avoided. The problem of that wire being buried in there is no longer a problem. It's not the tree you want to look at in your front yard, though. The tree will survive, even if it's a sucker that comes up 6 feet away in your neighbor's yard and grows there. That tree's gonna survive, but not in a way that's beautiful to you. So it was, again, this problem with staking and wires being left on too long. All right, pruning trees, pruning shrubs. There's a whole class that we do about it. There's also classes all over town that you could probably find about pruning, and it is specific to our climate. There's a whole lot about do not prune in the middle of summer, probably anything. It's just too stressful, and you let too much light in that could burn the skin. Remember, these are just a few general rules. So I mentioned the class because I'm not going to get that deep into it right now. There's some real basic rules about pruning here, and it's always try to do it. I'm sorry. The first one is if it's necessary at all. People think I got to prune, or you pay a landscaper to come once a month and do something. So when there's really nothing to do, they trim something to get their money's worth, get your money's worth. If you come out and nothing's done, you're not going to pay them for another month. So they sometimes pruning gets done because people just feel like they have to trim, and it really doesn't. It's not the case. Every leaf on a plant is valuable, and every one that gets lost is a loss in production as far as that plant's system goes. Every plant produces energy. Every leaf produces energy for that plant. Every one that you take off is going to hurt the plant more than help it. Pruning is more so for our own aesthetics, for what we think looks pretty, and also sometimes for safety. If a tree branch looks like it might be unsafe and crash down on the house or car, maybe in that case. But just prune to prune, or prune because you think it looks better this way than that way, is not always necessary. So just remember that, know how plants work, just make a decision based on that, and don't feel like you just have to prune because that's what people do. So pruning too much all at once is what leads to the worst problems. So prune little by little. If you could take one branch out and let the tree recover a little bit, let the bush recover a little bit, and then go back out and take the next biggest problem out, and then let it recover from that, it's much better for all kinds of reasons. You're not losing. Remember, every leaf that you lose is hurting the plant, because now it starves to death. If you cut every leaf off of a plant, most plants don't live through it. Some do because of stored energy underground. Some don't. I mean, it's starvation, basically. There's no food being made until leaves grow back. So it's a hard situation on a lot of plants to trim a lot at once. So it's always better little by little. The only time I would recommend pruning a lot all at once is if a plant loses all of its leaves in the winter. A dormant tree, dormant bush. Some do here. We don't have a lot of those here, but some do. And in that case, you could trim as much as you want in the winter without a problem. Because of that rule, the problem with pruning is you're losing leaves that make energy, and you're losing leaves that make shade for the branches. Well, neither one of those cases is valid on a dormant plant in the winter. Is the only reason you could trim a lot on that. So in general, little by little is always better. If nothing else, it means the little bit you trim goes in your trash can and it goes away, and you don't have to hire a dump truck to go to the dump with all this stuff that you decided to trim all in one weekend. So for many reasons, little by little is my pruning rule. let's see. I keep talking about sunburn, right? So when you allow sun to hit the trunk or branches of a tree that's normally shaded by its own leaves, even desert trees. This is a sweet acacia tree. And what's happened is it's been trimmed in the summer up high to get the sight lines. You know, it's a street tree. You got to be able to see under it. They trim it up real high in the middle of summer. Boom, the sun comes in, burns the skin on the west side of the trunk. You'll always find this on the west side of a trunk unless it's on a tree that's been in a nursery spinning around. But if it's planted in the ground and this happens, it's always on the west side of the trunk where the sun is most intense. You don't notice it usually for a year until the bark starts peeling off and underneath it is dead wood. That is so damage is long gone. And a lot of people, when they find this, I don't know if you see in the middle of this slide, there's a little perfectly round hole in that bark. That's where a borer beetle, a grub, you know, like a worm, chewed its way in and ate some of the tissue underneath that burnt skin. So what I usually get is people finally notice this bark is peeling off. They come to the nursery, how do I kill borer beetles? So that's not the problem. You know, the problem was the sunburn. All the borer beetles that we have here in the low desert, they can only eat dead tissue. So the original problem was the sunburn. Then the borers went in and only ate the dead tissue that died from the sunburn, and then they went away. So killing the borer is not the solution to this problem. It's making sure that you don't trim too much in the summer, making sure that you let the tree shade its own trunk and branches, and never trim too much all at once. So another thing that causes sunburn is drought. If you let a tree dry out too much, more than they can handle, then they can also cause sunburn, because the theory here is trees pull water in from the roots and evaporate it out the leaves. That's what they do all day long. That's how they work. That's how they stay cool in the summer. That's how they grow. That's how they bring up minerals and everything. So water comes in the root, water goes out the top first, really, and then sucks it in through the roots. Well, if that water is flowing, everything stays cool. The trunk stays cool, the branches stay cool, the leaves stay cool. The second that flow stops, and it could stop for multiple reasons. It could stop because the water's gone, all the way gone, or it could stop because you chopped off all the leaves, right? If the leaves aren't evaporating water, the flow stops. So you could cause this, even if it's sitting in water, you could cause the flow of water to stop by chopping off all the leaves. So one more reason not to prune all at once. But when that happens, the sun comes in, and without that flow of cool water going up through the trunk, the sun really burns that west side of the trunk. So it's a combination, but pruning is key all the way around. Do not prune too much all at once, and especially not in the middle of summer. So shrubs, talked all about trees. How about trimming shrubs? The way you trim shrubs does affect their resilience to drought. And the main concept is, if you, let's talk about naturally again. All of our desert adapted shrubs, naturally, they put on some new growth in the spring. You know, the weather warms up, maybe a little winter rain, they put on some new growth, get all fluffy and green. And then as it gets hotter, dry, windy, May, June, all those leaves, like, they harden off, they change color, even they get a little less green, you know, harden off, and that makes them ready for the summer, ready to deal with the heat. And that's the natural way that most trees and shrubs deal with the oncoming summer. Well, if you chop all those branches off, it stimulates a response that grows new growth out. And why? Because they're starving to death again. You cut off the little energy factories that are the leaves, and they have to replace them no matter what. So now the idea that they're getting ready for summer and hardening off out the window. It switches gears to, I have to have leaves back no matter what. So they've put out this really pretty new growth. And that's why we do it, because it makes them stay pretty. And if you water them enough, they stay pretty. But here's where we talk about water. By doing that over and over and over all summer, you keep them hedged, is what I'm talking about. If you keep them shaped and hedged, and cut off those hardened leaves, new growth comes out, looks beautiful, but you got to water a lot more to keep that all healthy. They're not adapted to drought that way anymore, even though the species is adapted to the heat and the drought and living in the desert only on rainfall. If you trim them this way, you throw that out the window. Now they're not adapted to the drought anymore. They need to be watered more often to maintain those tender little shoots that you forced to come out at the wrong time of year all year long, nonstop. So that's the whole scoop on like how you trim a shrub affects how it handles drought. So if you want a drought resistant shrub, you have to let it do its natural thing. It doesn't have to let all your shrubs be 15 feet tall and covering up your whole yard. There is ways to trim that aren't hedging. So the main way, and again, I can't get too deep into it with this class, but say you got one of these taller shrubs like orange jubilees or like this, or yellow bells, or shrubs that just get like giant in no time. What you can do is trim branches off. I'm going to go back to the little by little. You find the tallest, biggest, most vigorous branch, you follow it all the way down to the dirt and chop it out of the middle. And that's it for today. You know, you leave it, you throw it away, and you leave it to recover a little bit. And then in a couple weeks, a month, you come back, get the next biggest branch vigorous and cut it back down to a level that's low. And you won't even know if you do this, the shrub will be 3 or 4 feet shorter, but you won't even know that it has been cut. The concept is it looks natural still. There's still flowers all over it. It doesn't look chopped when you're done. It looks like nothing happened other than like it got shorter. So that little stub way down there is hidden by the rest of the bush. This is kind of a bad example because I had to do it on like a younger plant that's in a pot, but that's the basic concept is there. You can also pick a higher level to chop the vigorous tops. You can cut out one by one, but you can also pick a point where a little tiny branch with some flower buds on it is coming out. A lot of people say, oh, my orange jubilees never bloomed, but it's because they hedge it. So a lot of bushes we have bloom on the tips of the branches. Some bloom in the middle. So there's bushes that bloom in the middle of the bush, and there's bushes that bloom on the tips of the bush. And if it's a bush that blooms on the tips and you hedge it all the time, there's another problem is you never get flowers. So leave a little bit of those little tips behind. They'll bloom, they'll continue blooming. So this thing is like half the size as it was when I started with just 2 cuts. And I'll come back later after it fills in and fluffs out and do the same thing again. And you can maintain them like that any time of year you want. That's the beauty of trimming this way, little by little, is you don't have to remember, oh, this plant I can trim in the fall and this one I can trim in the spring and this one I got to wait till it's dormant. If you do little by little, it's anytime you feel like it, as long as you don't only take off a branch or 2 every time and don't let a lot of sunshine come in and burn the inside of that bush or promote all kinds of new growth. It's going to need a lot of water and fertilizer to continue. So that's the brief trimming. So now it's about water. So I said there was 3 things about this class to make your landscape resistant to our extreme climate and drought. And it was picking the right plants, which means also putting them in the right spot that they need to grow in. The next thing was how to maintain them. We talked about pruning, staking, planting, all that. Now we're going to talk about watering, which it really does come down to watering. Watering is the way that you create a large root system, is how I'm going to start this. So the importance of a large root system is this. Different plants store water differently, but they all have ways to store them. Succulent plants mostly store that water above ground. Aloe vera, for example, or a cactus, the water is stored in the fat tissue above ground. So their root system is there, but not extensive like a tree or a shrubs would be. Those plants are very desert adapted. They're great. Please use them. You know, yuccas, agaves, aloes, cactus, euphorbias, all of them are made to deal with drought. So if you can find a spot for them in your yard, enjoy them, love them, and you don't have to do much except for, deep soak them every once in a while to fatten them up. Probably with the hose, not with your drip system, because those kind of plants, the danger would be overwatering more than underwatering. So you definitely don't want to hook them up to the same drip system that's watering your fluffy hibiscus plant or something, But if your whole yard is nice and desert adapted, then you could put them on the drip system and let it all run at a very infrequent rate. So that's those kind of plants. How about leafy trees and shrubs? Even that hibiscus, if you had to have it, there's ways to make it more drought tolerant than they naturally are. And especially all the desert adapted trees and shrubs that hopefully you pick, those can be very well adapted to our drought if you lead the root system down deep and wide, right? And we're going to talk about how to do that, because trees and shrubs, leafy trees and shrubs, don't have an above ground succulent part to store water in. They have roots underground. That's how they store water. So when water's available, roots grow and they suck up that water and hold it until the tree needs it. And if water keeps coming at a regular rate, that root system gets bigger and bigger and bigger to store more and more and more water, deeper and bigger. And deeper is better because the water deep is cool all year round. For one, 3 feet deep, it stays cool. And also it's the water that's 3 feet deep is protected from evaporation. The water that's on the surface isn't for the plant. It goes up into the air and the plant never gets it. So it's wasted water. So you want that water deep. And that's how you get trees and shrubs to be drought tolerant, like the succulents are naturally, is you build a strong giant root system underground, because that's where they store water. And if you get them that way, they can absorb a lot of water and hold it for a really long time. And that's how you get a drought resistant landscape. So how do you do that? How do you promote a big root system? It's with irrigation, where the roots go where the water is. So you put the water where you want that root system to be, and you baby them through the first couple of years. And once they're established, you can sometimes even turn off your irrigation system and just push it manually once, twice a year when it's the driest and the hottest of the year. That would be wonderful, right? And still have a beautiful landscape. So let's talk about what you do here. So I talked about the depth, right? When you water, make sure it soaks in the depth of 3 feet deep. And there is exceptions, vegetable gardens, I don't think probably could reach water 3 feet deep. It might be more 1 or 2 feet deep. Lawns, although I do know that Bermuda grass can get water 3 feet deep. Ryegrass in the winter does not usually, but so those are the exceptions. Any tree or shrub or palm or cactus or whatever that is well adapted to the desert can put roots 3 feet deep. So try to get the water to soak in 3 feet deep, and that's where the roots will go down. And that's a safe place for water to be, safe from evaporation and safe from the heat. If you do this, then only if you do this, if you soak the water in deep enough, then you can start to let your plants go dry for longer and longer and longer periods of time between waterings. If you're only soaking the water into the very couple inches of the surface of the ground, the plant's roots might get it there. They'll put roots where that is, up in the surface of the ground, but you're going to always have to water every day for the rest of the plant's life. They're not resilient to periods of drought. So that's what we're going to talk about. And there's really 3 ways so irrigation, I do another whole class, is a couple different ones on irrigation, but this is the brief of it. So there's 3 ways to not give enough water to your plants. You could not be soaking the water in deep enough. A lot of people tell me, I know I'm watering my plants enough because I water them every day. But what they don't say right away is they're either out there squirting it with the hose for 1 minute every day, or their drip system is set for 5 minutes once a day, every day. And like I say, you can maintain a plant that way sometimes, but it grows a very shallow, very weak root system that's not resilient at all if they survive that type of watering. So the depth is very, very important. Say it again. The area means the theory on this is the whole area under the plant should get wet when you water. The width of the plant, the drip line they call it, as wide as the top of the tree is, the whole area under that should get wet. It's hard on a big tree with a drip system. You should be adding drip emitters to the ground underneath a bigger tree as the tree gets bigger, even a bush as it gets bigger, you add drip emitters to it. Maybe you change the 2 gallon per hour small drip emitters you have to a 4 gallon per hour or 10 gallon per hour. That bigger plants need more gallons of water. And it's the opposite. You might think, well, he just said they're going to need water less often. But I'm not talking about frequency. I'm talking about the area that gets wet. Remember, we're trying to promote a deep, wide root system. So the water, when you do water, has to go deep and it has to go wide. And that's a lot of gallons of water. But those gallons of water can all be stored in that root tissue and held onto and safe from evaporation in the environment for a really long time. So what we're trying to do is spread out the frequency of watering. And the only way to do that is to give enough water when you do water, soak it in deep enough and wide enough so that that tree's large root system can suck it all up. So the first one is the depth. And the reason, so 3 feet deep, how do you know? You can't see down there, whatever. If your plants are doing good and you're watering for an hour or two, you can probably guess you're getting close to that, but different soils are different, you know? So the soil type matters a lot. And I'll tell you the two extremes here. The one on the left is sandy, gravelly soil. And you might have it if you live in the kind of deserty areas of town. It might be like if around you is all desert and hilly, it might be sandy, gravelly soil in your yard. If you live in the flat part of the valley, it's probably nice right in the middle, like the loam in the middle. And I have seen clay soils here, and it's usually because our soil, our nice soil, has a little clay in it, and when it gets wet and there's construction equipment drives over it, it can get compacted to where water doesn't go through it very well anymore. So that's the extreme. So if you have the sandy soil, the sandy gravel soil, that means when you make a puddle out in your yard with the hose, it goes away like instantly. You can't, it's hard to even back up the water into a puddle, is the extreme of sandy. In that kind of soil, you're going to need your drip emitters to put out a lot of water all at once, right? A heavy flow of water to spread out to be the width of the plant. The area that gets wet, it's going to be hard to make a puddle that big in sandy soil. So you need high flow drip emitters. But they don't need to run for very long, because to get to 3 feet deep, the way you do that is running it longer and longer and longer, right? The depth is completely dependent on the run time, how long you run it for. And so in sand, heavy flow of water for a very short period of time. On the other hand, with the clay, a heavy flow of dripper runs off into the gutter, so it doesn't soak in very fast. So you need a very slow flow of water coming out, and you need to run it for a very, very long time. Your run time to soak it into 3 feet deep is going to be maybe 3-4 hours in that extreme case. So those are the extremes. Hopefully you're in the middle and it's average about a 2-hour run time to soak it in 3 feet deep in most of the flat parts of the valley. Like if where you live used to be fields, if you know that or not, or, you know, city all around, and not real hilly or deserty, then probably you got pretty good soil right in the middle. It's about 2-hour run time, and you just have to make sure you're putting enough drip emitters out there to wet the whole area under the plant when you water. So this is about the drip emitters. The depth is dependent on your run time, remember, how long it runs for. The area that gets wet is dependent on the drip emitter. This picture here is a good example about the best you can do with drip emitters, right? There's 4 big wet spots around this tree, and they're more or less the diameter of the top of the tree. I mean, we're going for like progress here, you know, best you can do with drip. That's about as good as it gets. So doing a good job. They got the flow of those emitters for their type of soil is plenty to spread out and make a big size puddle all the way around the tree. Took 4 of them to do it at this size tree. Well, when that tree grows twice as big, they're going to need 8 drip emitters under it, you know. So as it grows, you dig down, you add drip emitters. So this is a little example, little experiment I did. I put a piece of poly tubing on the ground, you know, it's like just right above ground, so I could do the experiment. About 4 feet apart, I put the one on the left is a 1 gallon per hour drip emitter, and the one on the right is a 4 gallon per hour drip emitter, right? So 2 different flows of water coming out was the difference on 2 wet spots. I took the tube away and the drip emitters, and I started digging in the wet spots that they made. Well, the thing that was the same was a 2-hour run time. What's the run time do? The run time soaks it into a certain depth in your soil. So in my soil, 2 hours soaked both of these spots into about a foot. That's a 1 foot ruler, the yellow thing. And I dug down till I hit dry soil, right? So 2 hours only soaked in 1 foot in my soil. But they did exactly the same thing depth wise, because the depth is determined by the run time. So same run time on both, they both soaked in the same depth. So what's different about these 2 wet spots? The one on the right, where I had the 4 gallon per hour drip emitter, got much, much wider, right? It's like 2 feet wide instead of 1 feet wide. So this shows you right here how you control both of these aspects. The depth of the water is controlled by how long you run for. And I need to run this for probably 4 to 6 hours to get it to soak in 3 times as deep as I did. And the width of the water is dependent on what size flow the drip emitters have, what size drip emitters you have. So remember that. Know that your goal is to wet the whole area under the plant and to soak the whole thing in 3 feet deep. This is with trees and shrubs and cactus for that matter, whatever. Any kind of desert adapted plant that you're trying to grow other than lawn and vegetables and things like that. This is the way that you're going to try to do it. Those are the goals. So now that you know that the area got wet, the depth is right, now you can start messing with frequency. And frequency is what everybody thinks of when I talk about you're not watering enough or you're watering too much. That instantly people think like often enough, not like deep enough or wide enough. This is the one that people think of. So frequency is important. And honestly, frequency, how often I water is what changes all year round. I don't ever change. Once I figure out how long that I need to water to soak the water in 3 feet deep, that never changes. The same run time is winter, spring, summer, fall. Once I figure out my start time, like if I want my drip system to start at 7 p.m., that doesn't change throughout the year. So I don't change that either. So every time I open my timer and see if everything's going good, all I do is make sure my program's still there. And you'll know that if the current time is right and not flashing, you know your program's probably good. And so I go to the frequency of each program and make sure that's right for the season. So the frequency changes all year round. 5 times, honestly, is at least for me, because it's like winter, spring, summer, fall, and monsoon. And the monsoon is the one most people don't think about, but when it starts getting real humid in late July and August, you can back off your water a little bit because dry air sucks plants dry faster than humid air. So May and June are the peak of your frequency, like the most frequent throughout the year are going to be May and June. And then like you can back off a little bit in August, and then you can really back off in the cool weather through the winter. So the frequency changes all the time. Check your timer, know how to do it. But the frequency is something that we can really mess with and adjust so that we can get landscapes that are very, very drought tolerant. This is how we can save water. The best way to save water is to stretch out that frequency longer and longer and longer, the older that plant gets and the more established it gets. So factors that affect how often the plant needs water are climate. The humidity I just mentioned is a big one most people don't think about. Wind, because wind sucks plants dry too. The faster the wind is, they really dry out faster. That's May. May is always windy like that, and it's super low humidity, and it's about the worst time of year for a plant, even though you're feeling nice because it's a nice breeze and dry air. And then you feel horrible, gross when it's August and muggy and humid. That's when your plants start perking up. So remember, they're the opposite of us as far as feeling good with weather situations. Soil type we talked about, right? Different types of soil take water differently. You got to figure out what your soil does, what your soil needs to accomplish those goals. Plant type would be pick those plants that are adapted to our climate, and then you'll have success with them. And don't pick plants that no matter what you do, you're still never going to be successful because they just really don't grow here. Plants age and size. This is very important to the water needs. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. I'll leave it. But the frequency changes from the time you plant that plant in your yard to the time it gets established. It gets forever, really. The frequency gets longer between waterings from almost every day when you first plant that plant to further apart. And a really good desert adapted landscape someday could be completely turned off your irrigation system and only supplemented on the worst of cases. So size and health of root system is the key. That's what we are creating with this regimen of irrigation and all that. Microclimate and exposure means a plant in this full sun is going to need a little more water than one in a little bit of shade. Or like if you have a lot of trees in the yard, everything's going to be a little more sheltered from those other things like wind and temperature and sunshine and all that. So in microclimate, you can create more of a foresty situation in a yard and keep that kind of humidity in there. And it changes the frequency that you water also. Maintenance, we talked about, hedging those shrubs really creates a situation where they need more water all year round and they can't use their natural adaptability to drought. Also trees, when they're lollipop shaped with a long skinny trunk all exposed to that hot sun, cannot use their natural adaptations to surviving our climate when you don't let them be the shape and size, the shape that they're naturally made to be, that's adapted to our extreme heat. So this is the watering schedule for something brand new. So you notice it's almost every day, even in the winter, really. I mean, I would just water as much as you can when you first plant something in the ground. I even do this with the hose, especially if it's something, one thing you just put out in the yard, the rest of your yard is established and working fine on a very infrequent water cycle. Water the new one with the hose, if you can. And it's every day. And remember, so it's every day. And then it goes to every 3 or 4 days, then it goes to once a week, then it goes to like after 8 weeks, hopefully, if you've been doing a good job, it doesn't wilt anymore. You don't go out there and, oh man, it's wilted. It's like it should be getting some roots into the ground, and then you'll notice the big difference. They start to grow again, and they don't wilt when you forget to water them again. And so that means they're starting to get established. Even at 8 weeks, it can happen even quicker. I mean, some plants are very quick to do it, a week or two. Sometimes some plants are so vigorous that they'll get roots out into that wet soil around them. And remember, this is the frequency. It's only the frequency. You still want to water these brand new. If your whole yard's brand new, you still want to soak that water in 3 feet deep. Even though the roots are up in the first foot where the pot was planted, where do you want those roots to go? 3 feet deep, right? So you put the water 3 feet deep because that's where the roots are going to follow. So your run time is whatever it takes to soak in that deep from the very first day you plant the plants. So again, you don't change the run time. You figure it out and then you leave it. And that's all. So the run time stays. The depth of the waters from the very first day. What changes throughout the life of the plant is the frequency. And it has to be, unfortunately, it has to be very frequently right away when you plant that plant in the ground, because it doesn't have any roots in that wet soil around the root ball. But you make that soil wet around it, it grows down into that space, and that's the first way to get started on making a resistant plant. So the basic rule is for watering frequency is when the soil surface dries out, you can water again. And you should check this, if you think your timer is going to kick on today, go out there before it does and make sure the soil looks real dry on the surface, because if it's still wet and it waters again, that's the only time you should worry about too much water. If the soil never dries out between waterings, it could be too much water and could be hurting your plants because it's too much water. And it's definitely a waste of water, because no plant needs water constantly without ever drying out. Sometimes it hurts the plant, sometimes it just wastes water. Either way, if the soil's still wet, make sure that it's not going to kick on and water again. And that changes throughout the year, remember, so check it often, make sure that that's how you really, because I can't tell you that in June you should water once a week, and in July you should water once every 8 days or whatever. I can't tell you, because your soil's different, your plants are different, the age of your plants is different, all these things. So it's up to you, but I'm going to try to give you the tools you need to kind of figure out when your plants need water. And that's the one that I can always use, is if the soil dries out between waterings, that's a must. But the surface of the soil dries out, and then there's this long period of time before the plant wilts, right? And if you really want to save some water and really push your plants to get deeply rooted, you wait until you find the first signs of drought. And we're going to talk about a few signs of drought, so you could look for that. Definitely don't water if the soil's still wet. You can water if the soil dries out on the surface, but if you really want to save some water, check it out, watch it every day, and the first signs of drought, then that's the longest your yard can go at this age without water at this time of year. So and plants don't die from that. They from one day, if you're really out there paying attention and you notice something wilted, plants don't die from wilting one day. It's just going to give you the sign that you need to know that, oops, I pushed it one day too far. So let's see some drought. So some signs of drought. So the one on the right, It's wilted. The citrus in pots and wilt fast, you know. It needs water like now. And if I watered it, big deal, perks back up, next day's fine. If I let it do that over and over and over again, there's another sign of like consistent drought that people aren't as familiar with, and that is older leaves in the middle of the tree gradually turning yellow over a long period of time and falling out. And what you'll see is a tree that is like bald in the middle with green tips on the outside. You think like it's not wilted, it can't be, it's got to be getting enough water, it's not wilted. It's wilted and you didn't notice probably, or it's come close to wilting and then got water and came back. And so wilt is an immediate sign of drought, like you water it today and it perks up, big deal. If you next time water a couple days before that, now you know you pushed it. And by pushing them to the limit like that, not only is it not, you don't have to be afraid you're going to kill it if you're really paying attention. But also when plants go through drought like that, they know that there's a absolute reason to grow their roots down deeper, because this is going to happen again, and they have to be prepared. So they set in motion all these things that happen, like growing deeper root systems to find water that will last longer. So it actually stimulates them to become a little more resistant to drought by letting them dry out almost to the point of wilt. So watch for it, and don't worry that it's going to die if you wilts a little bit. And also watch for that subtle sign of like long-term drought of bald in the middle with green tips. And if you look in the middle one, that's the middle one. I'm talking about the middle one as far as that subtle sign. And this, it's real subtle in the photo because it's hard to see, but if you could see in the pot, surface of the soil in the pot, there's a lot of leaves that have fallen out. They turned yellow, fell out. The old leaves is what does it, and that shows you that it's a natural. It's what trees and leafy trees and shrubs do to compensate for not having enough water. Every leaf needs a certain amount of water. If they're not getting enough water for every leaf, they choose which leaves to drop and which ones not. And they always save the brand new leaves at the tips because those are the most important. They're new, they're useful, they're working well, they're not in the shade of other leaves. What they ditch is the old ones in the middle. So the old leaves in the middle will turn yellow, fall out, natural, totally natural, happens over the period of weeks, maybe months. It's just a sign that they're not quite getting enough water to stay full and beautiful, like the one on the left. One on the left is like getting as much water as it needs, never suffers any drought. So, I mean, none of these are death sentences. It's just the signs that might tell you, okay, now I'm pushing these plants to get a little more adapted to drought and grow a little bigger, deeper root system. But this all takes observation. It takes that deep soak of wetting the whole area under the plant when you water, and then watching a lot and making sure you notice any signs. And I'll always find a canary in the coal mine out there. One plant will be the first to wilt long before anything else even comes close to it. And sometimes I almost put one of those in on purpose to kind of gives me the sign. It's like it doesn't seem to hurt much. I water and then it comes back, no big deal. But it's the one that wilts first, and I always notice that even before it wilts, it's looking a little peaked, like a little off color before the leaves actually like droop, or it's losing old leaves in the middle, turn yellow. Okay, now it's time to maybe water a little more frequently, and then go back to watching it. So shrubs do the same thing. This is a green cloud sage, real common, real desert shrub, little tiny fuzzy leaves. The one on the left's getting a ton of water, fluffy green, growing well. The one in the middle is super wilted, and that's very subtle. Look at the color; it just goes to like off color. I can tell from a block away because I'm used to it and I've seen it a million times. But that's what you're looking for in a lot of these, is just that if you walked up on it and felt the leaves, they would be like soft, not perky. That's wilt. But again, you water it, boom, comes right back. And the one on the right is that subtle sign of drought, bald in the middle. Tips are green, healthy, perky, but the leaves in the middle have turned yellow and fallen out. And that means that it's just not quite getting enough. And if you get to this point and you want that plant to look good again, you water a little more frequently and you trim the tips, just the tippy tips, cut them back a little bit, and they'll fluff back out like the one on the left in no time. So this is just the way that you kind of continue to diagnose how infrequently you can water your landscape at the age that it's at right now. It's a hibiscus, a red hibiscus, which do okay here, even in the full sun sometimes. But the one on the left does not get enough water, and the one on the right is getting plenty. Same thing over and over again. I'll just leave it at that. But all the old leaves turned yellow, fell out of the one on the left for the same reason. So subtle sign drought, and not death sentences. Watch for them. If you see them, you know that you are really saving water and maybe need to save a tiny bit less. Do the same concept. Old leaves turn yellow, right? Prematurely. All palm leaves, as they get really old, they turn yellow, then brown, then lay on the ground. They don't fall off like a regular tree or shrub. But if that yellowing is getting further and further and further up the plant to where almost all the leaves are yellow like that, it means it's probably not getting enough water. And it's slow. Palms are very slow to show you that they're drying out. I mean, it's months of drying out before they show signs. The problem is once you, oh, I need water more often, it takes months to come back. They're just slow in everything they do. So just watch carefully. And the first signs of like leaves that you think shouldn't be turning yellow yet, they are. Try to deep soak it, maybe with the hose. Real good deep soak, 4 or 5 hours with the hose, and then get it a jump start like that, and then turn your frequency up a little higher, a little more frequently. Even agaves show you that they're drying out. The one on the left is shriveled up from not enough water. They're drought hardy, but there's a limit. So that's what you're, and again, no big deal. You water it real good, deep soak it with the hose, and poof, it pops out like the one on the right in no time. If that was drought that was causing that to look like that. And so cactus also show you, and you really should wait for any signs of drought on cactus, because the fatal thing for a cactus is too much water. They fall over, and what you find in the ground is like a smushy, gross brown sludge where they rotted, so that they don't come back from that. But they do come back from drought, no problem at all. It's what they're made to do. Shrivel up to almost nothing, and then get water and puff back up to fat, and then shrivel up and puff back up. And so on this prickly pear pad type cactus, I see the wrinkles at the trunk of it, like one pad that's buried in the ground. It's got a little bit of wrinkles in it. That's okay. That would be a sign that I need to water now. The bent over pad is probably past the point. That's the actual wilt. The pad that's droopy down, they rarely are able to lift it back up when you water them. So what I do is just cut the end of it off. That part that's going straight down, trim it off right at the joint, and the rest of the cactus fattens up, no big deal. And that's even if I left it like this is like weeks or maybe months past the time I should have irrigated, and no problem at all. Puff right back up after a good deep soak. These kind of cactus, columnar cactus, it could be a saguaro, a cirrus, an organ pipe, whatever. They have pleats in them, right? And they can swell up to be almost a perfect cylinder, and then they can shrivel up to be like an accordion or whatever. Like the pleats get deeper and skinnier. And where my fingers are at there, that's just the thickness of that little ridge is kind of how you tell how they're doing. This one is very dry. It's very thin right there where I'm touching it. And the little bit of yellow color is also a sign. On the west side, they'll turn yellow like that from not getting quite enough water. So make sure that you're deep soaking them. And if they look like this, do it a tiny bit more frequently than you have been. But again, no big deal. And actually got time for questions.
Yes, wonderful presentation. Everybody help me give John a round of applause for a plantastic presentation. Everyone who knows me knows I love my good puns here. So thank you so much. And so we do have a couple of questions. Again, if you have any questions now, anyone that's tuning in, start typing them in the chat, and we're gonna right now work on the ones that we have received. But if you have any burning questions, we have about 15 minutes for questions. And so one of the questions that was submitted was, and you had a slide kind of about this for newly planted trees, about the frequency, but someone had mentioned if you have established trees and plants that get watered frequently, for example, every 2 days in the summer and every 3 days in the winter, how do you back the water off to get longer frequencies without shocking the plants and the trees?
So gradually, would be the key. Gradually, and you have to first make sure that you're soaking that water in deeply, because if you're watering shallow, you'll never be able to spread out the frequency. So if the whole area is getting wet under the plant and it's all soaking in deep, then you can start like one day extra every couple weeks. You stretch it out another day or two, and as you're stretching it out, those roots are being stimulated to grow into that wet soil down deeper. But you can't just all in one day. I'm glad they asked that question, because if you're watering for 5 minutes every day and your plants look okay, you can't right away say, oh, it says for established plants like every 2 weeks. You can't like quick switch your timer to every 2 weeks, leave it on 5 minutes, and maybe not add any more drip emitters. The key is to get all those gallons of water and all that soil wet when you water, and then start forcing the plant to grow deeper and deeper and deeper into that wet spot. But you can't, if you're not doing the deep soaking and the surface area wet correctly, you'll never be able to spread it out. But if you are, and you know that part's good, then it's just a gradual process of every couple weeks, you stretch it out. And for frequency, I didn't mention what I like to use. Most timers have, people think they're stuck with the days of the week, right? Like Sunday through Saturday. Almost all timers have another function. If you go through the days of the week, it has like odd days, even days, and then it'll say interval or skip days, depends on the brand of the timer. Use those if it was me, because what they do is they give you put a number in there. And if you put 2 in there, it means it waters on day 2. Day 1, no water. Day 2, water. And I mean, that's a bad example because I probably wouldn't do that on most landscapes, but you could put 15 days in there is a better example. So you could put 15, you put interval and then 15 days, and it won't water on day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And on day 15, boom, it waters, and then it goes back to day 1 and counts up again. To me, that's a much better way to water, because hopefully you get to the point where you're not watering once a week anymore. And there's no way to do that with the days of the week. People think they're stuck with like 1 day a week is the least frequent I can water, because there's not any more days of the week. So if you use that skip days or interval, you can stretch it out to 15 days, 20 days, 30 days, whatever you need, So
very good point.
Yeah. Anyway, go next question.
Yeah, good questions, guys. So another question that came in was, can I wrap the trunk of a tree that likely has sunburn? The bark has come off in layers, although the leaves look healthy.
Yeah. I would, it's probably not going to do much good, honestly. And what I don't like about wraps is they don't allow shoots to, what I would do is if it's making any kind of low growth, low branches, let that grow out, because it's going to be a much better way to shade the trunk with its own branches and own leaves. Even if someday you're going to go back and cut those branches off, leave them on for now temporarily. And it's the best way. Like I say, every leaf is a food factory for that plant. So you let those suckers grow out, and you can trim them back, but not off. And then you let them all fluff out. They're all got leaves on them. They're all putting energy right back into that spot where it needs to repair itself. And that's really the best way. And if you wrap it, those shoots can't come out. It stops them from coming out. So that after the damage is done, especially, I think the wrap would probably be detrimental more than helpful. I would make sure that your irrigation is plenty. Like I say, that if the water stops, the sunburn is worse. And don't do any trimming that would allow sun to get it. Just kind of leave it. Sometimes you got to leave branches temporarily, even though you don't think you're going to want them there someday, or they're in the way, just to let a tree repair itself. So I would try to keep it well watered, maybe a little fertilizer in the spring, tree and shrub food or something, and really get it growing, and let some low branches come out, or suckers, and let those help repair that wound and shade it with their own leaves. That's what I'd do.
Thank you, John. We have another question. Someone asked, how often do you need to fertilize your plants and shrubs here in the desert, and what time of year is best?
Okay, good. If you don't have to, remember. So if you really want your plants to grow fast, you can. But if you have desert adapted plants, desert soils are like infamous for not having any nutrition whatsoever. So if they've adapted to some desert soil somewhere in the world, they're also adapted to very, very low nutrient levels in the soil. So if you just want everything to look okay, you're happy with the size of them, and you don't want to be pruning all the time, you don't need fertilizer. If something's yellow, you might need a specific kind of fertilizer like iron or some kind of supplement for that. If the plant looks bad, or nitrogen, it might be. So, and if you have plants that are not desert adapted, maybe you have a Arabian jasmine or a hibiscus or a ficus tree or something that's not from a desert somewhere, those plants that I would use, like the easiest is tree and shrub food of any brand. They're all about the same. Read the directions on fertilizer very well, though, because there are different strengths, which means there are different amounts that you put on. And too much fertilizer is very easy to kill a plant with too much fertilizer. It's not, definitely don't think it's like more is better. And I've been tempted myself, because you get better growth with a little bit, and you get better growth a little bit more, and you get better growth a little bit more, and the next tablespoon kills the thing. So it's very important to read the directions on fertilizer if you're going to use it, but don't think it's necessary if you're just happy with the way your plants are growing and happy at the rate they're growing, or you're happy with the size. Sometimes the landscape's established and you don't want everything to get bigger faster all the time. It looks good the way it is, so let it be. Anyway, that's what I got to say about fertilizer.
Oh, excellent. So someone else had mentioned that their sago palm seems to be yellowing on the outside of the leaves. Could that mean that there's too little water?
It can. I actually put one in the spring against my own advice, but I like had to put it in. It was anyway, I put a big sago in that was transplanted into my yard last spring, and the oldest rack of leaves turned bright yellow. I mean, it's just what they do from stress. At sagos, they make all these leaves come out all at once, and hopefully yours has made like a new rack, a whole row of leaves that come out together. If it hasn't, it should, if it stays healthy. Those will all be perfectly adapted to where it's at. Full sun if it's in full sun, shade if it's in shade, and those shouldn't turn yellow. If they're turning yellow, like they grew out, it's been there for a while, it's established, and it started turning yellow prematurely, then maybe I would deep soak it again. Throw the hose on it 4 or 5 hours, get a real good deep soak, make sure it's getting enough water, and make sure you do everything we talked about as far as irrigating it. Deep soak, whole area wet when you water. So it could be, but it's also natural that if you recently planted it within the last year, all those leaves that were on it in the nursery when you bought it, they're going to turn yellow and burn like that. Only the new leaves that come out while it's in the place it's in now are going to be green. If those aren't green and it's been in for a while, then maybe it's not getting enough water.
And while we're on the topic of palms, someone had asked, how much can you trim off the fronds of palms? Should you only trim off the dead ones, and does it matter based on what type of palm it is?
Yeah, it doesn't matter what type of palm it is. But it does matter what leaves you take off. It's always okay to take off a brown leaf. It's always okay to take off a bright yellow leaf or old like that. If they don't look green, you could cut them off. The problem is that they have so few leaves sometimes. Every leaf that you take off is a huge hit in that energy factor I keep talking about. So every leaf is a plus to the system. Every leaf is important. It's making energy for the plant, and every one you remove starves it. So if you really do the big trim and I've seen people leave just that pokey leaf that's not even open yet in the middle, just to not have to come. I think it's for convenience. You don't want to come back in 6 months and have to do it again. So they think like, I'm going to do it all at once and get it over with, and I won't have to come back for a year or two. But it does really hurt a palm to cut off a lot of green leaves all at once. So a lot of rule people use is the leaves that are, if you want to cut any green leaves off, leave the ones that are horizontal or at an upward angle, and only cut off the ones that are at a downward angle. And then that leaves like a flat bottom, and then all the leaves on top. You could do that, but my rule is just for health, because I love plants and want them to be happy. I leave every green leaf on them as like that I can, so that's the healthiest way to do it. But if they're in the way, or you need to get them out of the way, then at least leave the ones that are like horizontal or upward growing, and never trim them all off up to the little pokey in the middle.
Great advice. So we have another question, and this is they're stationed in Texas, so we'll see. But I will read their question. So they had planted new plants and they put down weed cloth and 4 inches of mulch. And again, they're in Texas and they have clay, Victorian clay. The root balls get dry, but the area 6 inches away is moist, and they've been using a moisture meter, and most of the plants are doing okay, but some aren't. Do they just need to water the root ball, or should they water the entire area? And since they're in Texas, it's humid most of the time with temps in the 90s.
Yeah. So because they're newer is why I would use the hose, water the root ball, like I said, just water the root ball when necessary, but keep that soil on a regular irrigation cycle of like, I'm not sure the frequency there. It would be maybe once a week. Deep soak that clay once a week to make sure that there's water down deep, or else, because if there's not, the roots will never come out of that root ball and grow into it. So you're doing two things. It's two separate things. One is getting that water deep in the soil so that someday the roots can get down there to it. The other thing is keeping those plants from dying by watering just the root ball temporarily until they get their roots down into that wet clay. And it could take, I don't know, a year, 2 years on some plants. The mulch is a good idea though. I mean, for pure water retention and keeping the humidity high around the plants and everything. If you want more of a tropical yard or like fruit trees or roses or things like that around here, that much mulch is probably necessary usually.
Awesome. We have another question come in. So for Bermuda and ryegrass, do you also need a 3-foot soak, or can you do less?
This is it. Yeah. So ryegrass, it doesn't grow roots that deep. And in the winter, you don't have to water as much. I would follow that little chart that's in the back of the Watering by the Numbers book. And there's little charts everywhere that you find of like on an established yards, the frequency of watering, and they have cool season grass and warm season grass. Cool season grass would be the rye. And to me, usually I soak it in about a foot deep for the roots of ryegrass in the winter, and I follow the frequency that the chart says. It's but Bermuda grass is amazing stuff. It's like the worst weed you'll ever have if you don't want it, and it's like the best grass you'll ever have if you do want it. But Bermuda, I know I have flood irrigation in my property, and it's hard to find now. I know not everybody has that, but because I have it, I water every 3 weeks, and that grass is like bright green, and I still got to mow it all the time. So that's only because it soaks in 3 feet deep. So even in the case of Bermuda grass, I mean, it's hard to do. Normally people follow that chart for Bermuda also because it can survive on a foot deep of soaking in, and then you do it more frequently. It's like 2 or 3 times a week, and it stays nice. That's probably more common that people do that with Bermuda grass. But I know from experience that if you deep soak Bermuda grass to 3 feet deep, it can go a really long time looking good because the roots of it can get water that deep. Bermuda, but rye, no.
That's all the questions that we had submitted, but a lot of people put really kind comments. They said, great, thank you, enjoyed the class, thanks. This will be recorded. So again, this will be included in the follow-up email. And then thank you for answering my Texas question. This was really good. Awesome. Thank you all so much for attending. I want to make sure we end on time, and I do have some closing remarks that I want to share. And so we have one more class in our fall green living series, and our last class is water wise strategies for vegetable gardening. And so this class will be held also via Zoom, and it's exactly 2 weeks away from today, and that will be happening Wednesday, October 26th from 6 to 7:30, so same time. And again, for those who might have joined us later, you will all receive a follow-up email with the PowerPoint, the recording, and then a link to the survey. So again, please fill out that survey because you'll be entered in for a chance to win a gift card to a local nursery. And again, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you guys will join us at our final class this fall. I can't believe it'll be the final class of this year. Where has the year gone? But again, it's so fun hosting these classes for you all, and I really appreciate all the engagement that we have in the chat with all your questions.
Yeah.
And again, these resources will be shared in a follow-up email, but I want to give you all the rest of your evening to enjoy. And again, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. It was so great to have your wealth of knowledge and just all your expertise and advice and just sharing that to our attendees.
No, you're the best host too.
Thank you.
Good at this.